Hello. Rascal is an online tabletop news organization dedicated to factual, ethical reporting. The site was established a little over a year ago by journalists who had formerly worked at Gizmodo, Polygon, IO9, and Dicebreaker. Together they wanted to create a news organization that would focus on serious stories with a bit of trademark wit and character. And in recent months, there has been an increasing push to expand to cover more board games and miniatures war games as well. I have been following the journey of Rascal since it was established just over a year ago, and I am really pleased that there is a place out there still trying to do independently minded, proper ethical journalism about tabletop games, especially in an era of the internet where these kinds of websites are being shuttered, journalists are being fired, and there is the impending deluge of AI-generated nonsense about to flood the entire thing. Today, I am joined by one of the founders of the site, Rowan Zeoli, as well as the wargaming correspondent, Caeylin Ellis. We talk about the story of Rascal, the intention and vision for the site, how things are going, and what the future may hold both for Rascal itself and the tabletop industry. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Rascal News. Rowan, Caeylin, thank you both so much for joining me to talk about Rascal News. I suppose an interesting place might be to just start with your own sort of personal backgrounds with tabletop gaming. So where did you start from? Caeylin, do you want to start us off?
Many moons ago, when I was young and you were even younger, unless you get that reference, then you might be my age or older. I started with, I guess, from a early interest in fantasy and sci-fi and mythology and stuff like that. I got handed a copy of The Hobbit at a very early age. I got into like the classic like UK Games Workshop licensed board games, so your Hero Quest and your Space Crusade. I was into fighting fantasy books. A bunch of us that I was at school with, this is just in primary school, we were all into that stuff. Then one day, a friend came in with a copy of White Dwarf that his older brother had bought, and we were like, there's like a whole shop full of these things, and it was amazing. And from there, from Warhammer, discovered D&D because it was in the Argos catalog at the time. And yeah, just been gaming ever since.
Amazing, yeah. It's almost too late once you've started reading White Dwarf. There's no going back at that point, is there?
Nope.
And Rowan, what about yourself? Oh, have we lost Rowan there?
Oh no.
We'll take a moment, see if we get back off of the. I know there was some Wi-Fi challenges. I can always edit us all back together, so no worries.
Okay, and we're back. Oh no,
Okay.
Oh, boy. Yes, my internet connection is unstable, computer. Thank you. I really appreciate you pointing that out to me.
Would you want to tell us, Rowan, how you got started?
Yeah, so I got started. I was a fantasy kid when I was very young. I read like Aragon a bunch of times, which is just a Star Wars, Lord of the Rings ripoff, But it's, it was great, a great first introduction to the genre. I had been, unfortunately, a theater kid. I have since been reformed. Now, through that, I was at like a cast party. I was at a birthday party for my friends, actually. We played D&D 3.5. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I can like get into this. And that was a one session. And then 2 years passed and I had never thought about it again. I started watching Critical Role as like this generation of tabletop players really have gotten into it through actual play. I was like, oh, I really want to like get into this more. I was at a cast party. All of my nerdy inhibitions had been kept in the closet, just like everything else about me. And then I was like at a party, I was a little bit fucked up, and then people were like talking about D&D, and I was like, Dungeons and Dragons. And then I started playing a home game with them, and that got really cool. And then college happened, and I put it away in my little pit of shame.
Hmm.
I got kicked out of college, which is not great. And then when I had nothing to do while I was like working multiple shifts at Starbucks every day, I was like, let me just see if I can escape into this world. And I ran a game for some friends. Then kind of got out of it again. It's been this like on and off relationship with D&D for a very long time. I started getting into journalism. I was doing comedy journalism because I was a stand-up comedian. I started doing psychedelic journalism. Then I got into doing pharmaceutical journalism and did not have the institutional support to be doing that kind of reporting.
Right.
Did not go well for me. And I went, let me do something else. And I watched Dungeons and Drag Queens by Dimension 20, wrote a piece about that for Polygon, and then my career is here now. So it's always been this combination of my love for storytelling, because I've also been a book editor, but also my love of performance and just art that is made by little weirdos. I think that's always been my big drive to tabletop games.
Amazing. Yeah, that's great. And then obviously, so working at Polygon and sort of covering some of the aspects of gaming from a journalistic perspective. I mean, what was that like?
Well, so my journey to Polygon was also kind of strange because I wrote for Polygon, just doing some one-off commissioned pieces about actual play. And then I started writing for this volunteer site called The Fundamentals, being like, all right, let me just do this unpaid labor about this small niche art form, which started to gain some traction because no one else is really writing about actual play. There are very few, like as few tabletop journalists as there are even fewer actual play journalists. And so that started gaining some traction. I started writing for Tabletop News, if anyone here remembers that. That was awful and terrible, and I signed an NDA and can't talk about it right now publicly. However, I think they've collapsed, so we'll see how long that lasts. And then Lynn Kodega, who worked for IO9, released the OGL and the Hasbro Pinkertons stories. I was talking to them while I was at Tabletop News, and they then got laid off from IO9 and were like, I want to keep doing this. Do you want to start something? And then I was like, yeah, let's absolutely do this, because I've never had a steady job. I graduated college into 2020. And so I've been freelance my whole life. I was like, yeah, let me own something myself, because at least if there are ashes everywhere, I can start like putting the logs together in the apocalypse. And that worked out really well for me. I'm here now. We brought in Chase, and then we were doing that for a while, and then Lynn went off to pursue their Hollywood dreams, and then we were like, all right, let's expand the Rascal masthead. Let's figure out what we can do with this. We brought in Thomas and Caeylin, which truly has been the best decision we've ever made. And now Rascal's here. It's a very cool. We're going into our second year. We're doing our pledge drive right now, and we hope we can keep doing this for as long as there is games to write about.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating time, I imagine, to be creating something like Rascal as a sort of news organization from the ground up to try and sort of, capture all of the exciting stuff, and some of the less exciting stuff that's happening right now in gaming and the marketplace of gaming, because tabletop has become such a huge thing over the last couple of decades, I think. I mean, I'm curious about that period though so everyone's getting laid off, all the sort of established websites are dropping their coverage of, or at least reducing their coverage of tabletop gaming. The decision then to say, okay, well, actually let's put all our eggs in one basket and go for it, right? I mean, that must have been quite a tough decision to make.
Yeah, it was. I mean, for me, it wasn't super hard because I had no other prospects. I had skills and then nothing else. So it was easier for me. It was more difficult for Chase because Chase was also working at Dicebreaker at the time. Pour one out. That's also how we got Caeylin on board, because Dicebreaker collapsed and then Caeylin had some pieces that she was going to write. And then we were like, please give them to us instead and we'll pay you for them. And that's what happened. And it was great. But yeah, and so it's this idea of we're following the defector model, the aftermath model of rather than asking big billionaires to give us money and control our editorial output and say that we can't say certain things because it might upset investors. Now our investors and our shareholders are our readership and our audience, which is a huge difference. And then going back to your original question, which I did not answer, about how Polygon is different, there is a really distinct editorial difference between what gets to make the front page of Polygon or what gets to get on the site at all versus what gets to go on Rascal, because there are affiliate links, there are SEO requirements. I, through my contract there, got them to see the value of indie role-playing games rather than just D&D, and so we got to do a lot more coverage of that. And if you are tuned into the discourse at all, you can just go into the internet and see what people had to say about indie coverage on Polygon. I'm not going to repeat any of that here because I don't want to make enemies. But there's a huge difference between what we get to do at Rascal is just like we get to say what we think is important and listen to our readership of what they think is important. So we get to talk about how politics are intersecting. We get to talk about the cool little war game hobbies that Caeylin gets to do and be like, I'm painting my little guys, look. And that would never get time and space on Polygon, despite the fact that Charlie Hall is the biggest fan of like miniatures I've ever met. Just because it doesn't get the clicks, it doesn't get the affiliate links. And Rascal's a place, Aftermath is a place, Defector, Hellgate, 51 News, all of these places that are worker owned get to really determine what the future of coverage is, because as we see, like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal is all kind of capitulating to the biggest bullies in the room who give them money, which isn't working because they have all these like readership, like all of their subscribers are leaving because they want honesty. They don't want propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I'd love to come back around to like some of that decision making. But before we get into that, Caeylin, I'm curious about the Dicebreaker side of things as well. I mean, what was it like during the sort of those final days?
So I was freelancing for Dicebreaker, but on a regular basis. So I was doing usually a couple of articles a month, covering mostly miniature stuff. It's something I'd just fallen into by accident. I'd done some RPG articles for the site, and I think it was when Horus Heresy was coming out, and I was like, I kind of want to check this out, but I can't afford this big box right now. I wonder if Matt, who was the editor at Dicebreaker, will let me write about it for Dicebreaker, and then I can get a review copy. Cool. And so I did, and it worked out. And it sort of became a regular thing. And it was a nice sort of source of steady, stable work, which is really hard to come by when you're a freelancer. And then, yeah, as a freelancer, I wasn't told anything. I heard from out, like it was reported that IGN had fired a bunch of people and closed a bunch of the sites that they had acquired in the Gamer Network takeover. And I was just kind of flapping about trying to find out wherever I could. And Chase was the one who kind of set up a Dicebreaker freelancer support group, I think is the way how I like to think about it. To just gather us together, and we could like share resources and try and help each other land on our feet. And from that's how I got introduced to the Rascal crew. And for whatever bizarre reason, they let me join.
Great.
Yeah, Caeylin has a real humble British sense of humor where she self-deprecates and will not let us tell her how great she is all the time.
I mean, obviously now at Rascal, I mean, you mentioned there, Rowan, just around like being able to write whatever you, as the journalists, want to write. What do you think is important? And then I imagine there's a certain amount of you may not be beholden to billionaires looking over your shoulders, but like you say, you've got your shareholders are essentially the readers, right? So are you following that sort of, where do the clicks go within the site? What are people feeding back on the most or commenting on the most? Or do you still choose things based on this is just we think this is an important story we ought to tell?
So it's a combination. We actually don't look at viewership numbers at
Right.
all. We don't look at clicks per article. We don't look at what gains traction and what doesn't in that capacity, because we think that is, and speaking for myself, I think that is damaging to what journalism should be. I think, newspapers didn't have the ability to check what article in their latest edition got the most number of reads. They just know, oh, we sold this many copies this month, and we could assume it's probably for this. But that shouldn't influence the kind of articles you're writing. Something we've talked about a lot on the back end. We have a lot of discussions about what our responsibility is as an outlet, about what the role of journalism in this space, especially like entertainment niche journalism that is talking about games and what that is. And there's a responsibility that we have to decenter like the very homogenized North American games industry. We have a responsibility to be critical of larger players in the space. We have a responsibility to be a little self-indulgent and let ourselves enjoy this work so we can keep doing it. But we try not to go by that. We definitely recently looked at like some numbers that say that we did like a reader survey, and it showed that people want investigative reporting and interviews and criticism. And like that definitely is what gets the most clicks, is like the hot takes or the deeply, deeply investigated reporting. And so that's what we want to be doing, because that's what no one else in the space is doing. But figuring out the balance of what we want to be doing and what we think is important, and then what our readership is telling us is important, and what the zeitgeist is saying is important. And also like our recent piece that Chase wrote. Chase is really good at writing those kind of like really provocative things about going on in the space, like the no politics piece about how does saying no politics and like being apolitical in your coverage actually embolden like more fascist tendencies in some of the spaces that we're in. How does not acknowledging that Elon Musk did Nazi salutes during the inauguration, and that is why the RPG forums have all banned Twitter and X links, like talking about that explicitly is also our responsibility. And figuring out that balance is something we are constantly talking about.
Yeah, I imagine that must be very tough, especially in today's online climate, to be making those kinds of choices and committing to those kinds of things. I mean, one of the things I was super impressed by at Rascal is the very clear and transparent sort of ethics charter. There's clearly a lot of time and effort gone into that to say, right, here's how we're going to approach journalism. We're taking the discipline seriously, and the responsibility for getting stuff out there and exploring these stories. And it's not propaganda, it is reporting, it's factual and evidence-based, which I think is really great. And obviously that is very important, more important now perhaps than ever, given the internet. But then
absolutely, and we still got our opinions. We still drop our hot takes.
Sure, of course, yeah. And I imagine that's quite tough to balance that as well, right? Is it because you want, especially when it comes to something that's so characterful? Rascal News is very much an expression of its creators and its contributors, I think. So how you find the way to get to the factual reporting that comes from you as authors and as journalists, I suppose. You want people to read your truth, and the truth that you're exploring without sort of losing yourself to just the facts. Does that make sense?
We were talking about literally in our meeting right before this, like literally just a discussion we were having. A thing that we used to say a lot that we actually have said less in meetings since Thomas and Caeylin have come on, but I think is still true, is we write authentically but not cathartically. Is if you don't lean into the catharsis of being angry and like, because there's so much to be angry about, and like keep yourself authentic but not like cathartically, that is a good way to keep that balance, and something that honestly I should get tattooed on the inside of my eyelids.
Well, I'm curious as well though. If you're getting this reader feedback that okay, investigative journalism, that is one of the types of reporting we want to see more of. I imagine that is also the most labor intensive type of reporting, right? So the economics of that are presumably quite tough to balance as well. It must be easier to go, here's 10 articles that are just our reaction to a press release versus a deep dive.
Yeah. It's one of the things that Chase and Rowan have been saying ever since Thomas and I came on, which was, we're so glad that we have the extra support so that when somebody is working on something like that, like one of these deep dives, one of these investigative pieces, that the rest of us can kind of make sure that we've still got a nice flow of stuff to read, and also making sure that nobody gets lost in the weeds. Because it is tough reporting on some of these things, whether it's because the subject matter itself is particularly unpleasant, whether we have, say, strong reactions from people that we don't paint in a particularly good light because of their actions. We need to be there for each other to go, okay, you've done that, now go and write about some game that made you happy this week.
Yeah, like with the World of Game Design investigation that I did a couple months back, that took me 2-3 months to really line up, because I talked to 12 to 15 different people. It ended up being like I don't even know how many pages long. Like the transcripts initially were like 120 pages of transcripts and emails and notes that I had to sift down into a piece that still ended up being like 20 plus pages long. And I'm still recovering from that. And like the Polygon contract that I had that started in November did not give me any opportunity because, again, Polygon had me writing 10 pieces a week in a 19-hour work week. That is an unsustainable, insane amount of labor. As opposed to Rascal, where I got to work on that one piece and I would still put out like 1 to 2 pieces every week while I was still working on that. But really my main focus was like, I gotta make sure this is airtight. And Chase has said this publicly before. That is something like that type of investigation about like labor exploitation and all these other things usually has one person dedicated to doing that for months in a giant institution. I don't know how 404 Media does it. I have no idea how they are able to like survive putting out the type of work that they're doing all the time. But it's real hard. It's real hard.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, do you have like, do you work to quotas? Do you have, we need to get this many stories out every single week, every single day? Or is it more, the news comes as it comes?
A little bit of both. Caeylin, yeah, I've been talking a lot. What do you?
Yeah, we loosely aim to do 2 pieces each a week, which doesn't necessarily sound like a lot. But when you consider that we don't do effectively puff pieces, we're not rewriting press releases. So anything that we do write is going to be quite substantial, even the shorter ones. And that maybe one of those, like say, we could be working on something big for some time. And with that, and with the contributors that we have, we do try and make sure that we've got at least one piece that goes out every day, well, at least during the week. But we are usually hitting, 2 pieces most days, and sort of getting a steady flow. But at the same time, we are aware that it's more important that we do good work that is sustainable work, and that we don't burn out. And it's been abundantly clear, especially with the survey that we did recently, that our audience feels the same way. The main thing when we said, what could we do differently? And people say, nothing, keep doing what you're doing. It's great. And if you get more money, pay yourself more. Like, wonderful.
Yeah, I think something that we've really had to learn, or rather unlearn, I guess, is that very capitalistic drive to always be producing and always be making like content, which definitely lessens the quality of the work on the site of being like, we have to get 2 pieces out every single day. Ends up becoming, we put out interviews we don't care about that weren't well researched, or we put out pieces that are riddled with spelling mistakes because we are exhausted, because we're burnt out. Like, I think right now is a really great example. Like, there is a lot of really difficult stuff going on in the world. Caeylin and I are both trans women, and like navigating the attacks on trans people internationally right now is really hard. And we have a fantastic support team that literally are just like, hey, if you need to just curl up in a ball and play Citizen Sleeper 2 all day, like that's what we're gonna be doing. Like, we care about each other as people first, and because we care about each other as people first, the work reflects our like human-centric approach to journalism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I think you see that as well. And again, it brings it back around to some of the topics they've chosen, even down to, the recent sort of union activity with Vallejo and the sort of, the paint company. That kind of
Caeylin did
stuff.
a great job with that reporting.
Absolutely, yeah. And that doesn't seem to get as much traction across other news sites as you might hope. Because whether or not someone sees that as a controversial topic or not, it is still something that's happening in the real world that's affecting the industry and deserves to be talked about and explored. So it's great to see that sort of brought to the fore as well.
Like, yeah, go, Caeylin.
Okay. Because you could argue that what we are writing about games. I could talk your ear off for hours about how games are fundamentally really important. But even if you just see them as a fun diversion, it's still an industry surrounding them. It's people, they're being made by people. There is exactly the same network of people and potential abuses and problems and struggles that people face in that industry that you would face in any other industry. And it's only right and fair that the industry get reported on seriously like any other industry. Yeah. So like one of the earlier things I did about the EU GPSR regulations was basically I did because I saw a whole bunch of folks in the UK minis community suddenly being made aware of this really big thing that could affect their livelihoods and a whole new set of rules that they had to comply with. And there was no information about it. And I don't know how successful I was, but the point was just so I could write something that people could point at and go, oh, this is the situation. This is what we're all panicking about. Because at the time, all I saw was like lots of chat on social media and, in a couple of like industry like chats.
Yeah. Actually really interested in that, where does the breaking news come from? Is it just from keeping an eye on what people are talking about in Discord servers, on social media, in other reporting at other organizations? Or, are you just plugged into people in the industry? You got the contacts to sort of say, oh, this is something that's going to happen. You should be thinking about this.
Yes, and it's definitely a mix of both. It is a combination of psychic damage of being on social media and being like, all right, what's happening now? And like having to sift through what is discourse, what is newsworthy. That's a skill that's really developed rather than one someone knows innately. And And yeah, having sources in the industry is huge. Those usually end up coming through like the big breaking stories of the world of game design. I'm going to go back to that again. Would not have seen that if I wasn't on Blue Sky, or Twitter. Would not have seen that if I hadn't seen Ian's post. But then there are other stories that we get emails of tips of being like, hey, you should check this out. And then there's also the difficulty of we are still a 4-person team. So we get those tips and sometimes we don't have the resources to go chase that story down. I think a really great example is when the big Patreon change happened. We got a tip being like, hey, you should look into this because it's going to be impacting so many people. And we were in such a state of disarray while it was happening that we're like, we feasibly can't cover this because of the amount of time and effort it would take away from the rest of the site. And so navigating that balance is really, really difficult as well. But really is just being plugged in and just having your ear to the ground constantly.
Yeah. Actually, it's an interesting point about the Patreon change, obviously, which for people who aren't familiar with it was a change to the way in which fees were structured for Apple users via Patreon. And obviously, that is so intrinsically linked now with the wider hobby community online, lots of content creators who inform the way people engage with various aspects of the hobby. So I imagine that's a sort of, that's kind of a very new world kind of sort of challenge around tabletop gaming, especially tabletop gaming being a very traditional in many ways kind of hobby. This aspect of it is so based in the internet and so modern, I suppose, for want of a better word. Those kind of things must take a lot of unraveling.
Yeah, the weird thing about being a tabletop journalist, I don't know if you feel this way also, Caeylin, is that we're not just games journalists, we're also climate reporters, we're labor reporters, we're tech reporters. We have to have a little bit of expertise in all of these different worlds to be able to communicate effectively how the intersections of the larger world with our little hobby, how they come together and why it matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's again the GPSR thing. It's like I had to become a mini expert. I use expert very loosely, but I had to become certainly an informed layperson about EU trading regulations. How often do you think about EU trading regulations? Because I don't on a regular basis. It's a challenge. It's a big challenge when you come across something like that and having to figure that out. Even little things like language, because and I've got hopefully one of our listeners will watch this or listen to this and tell me if I've got this right this time. The Vallejo, that's apparently the pronunciation story, is the fact that it's actually they're based in Catalonia specifically. And obviously there's a whole lot of politics when it comes to Spain and the Catalan region. And you don't want to get that stuff wrong. So again, you end up having to do this research on a very specific subject that is only tangentially sort of related to what you're reporting on. But you've got to get it right because people see you as an authority.
Yeah, I'll bet a very tough challenge for some of the super niche within niche topics that they're talking about. On that sort of question, I suppose, I imagine it must be difficult not to be drawn towards the sort of, maybe there's twin suns now, but you've got the D&D when it comes to tabletop role playing is just so big, it's so immense. What Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro do as an entity just affects so many different aspects of the tabletop role playing hobby and industry. I think the OGL story that you mentioned before, Rowan, is a great example of how that then, what a decision made within Wizards created a load of games from other companies in response. So it has had huge ramifications for the entire industry. So it must be quite difficult not to just write about D&D and Wizards of the Coast all the time. And then I suppose the same is true when it comes to miniatures war games, Caeylin, with Games Workshop, right?
When I started at Rascal, I did a little informal poll on like social media and asking my friend groups and said, what games do you want to see me cover specifically? Because like I've got games that I already like and I'm aware of, or if I find interesting, I would like to cover them. Tell me what I should cover. The number one answer was not Warhammer.
Right.
And it's not because of like, you know, there are people who've built their entire personalities around hating Games Workshop. It's just because like those things are very well served. I mean, what do you say about like what interesting stuff do you say about Warhammer now? When in terms of like the news about the product itself, they've got Warcom, they've got like a whole machine dedicated to informing you about their product. There's so many good sites out there where people pick everything apart. So you know, from my perspective, is like I will write about Games Workshop and Warhammer when they do something that I feel is genuinely newsworthy as a company, and I will write about them in the context of if I play one of their games at any point in time and go, oh, that's really interesting. Here's something cool to write about. Then I will do that like I'll do it for anybody else. But my goal is to, I think, broaden people's horizons as much as possible. And I don't do that by telling people about things they already know about.
Yeah, and D&D and WotC are very, very similar in that way of like having this monolithic control over the space. They kind of suck up all the oxygen out of the room. And so much of the coverage we see, just like we see about like Games Workshop, is kind of this like sycophantic, like, oh my God, there's this new thing that's coming out. Here's this new supplement. Here's this new whatever. And again, a lot of them are rewritten press releases. A lot of them are kind of publicity in their own way that's not very critical. And a lot of the coverage we do of WotC is very critical because they are a huge corporation. We have written about their AI. We have written about their CEO and like how he navigates that. We've written about ways that they have messed up a lot of ways. Most recently, we had a contributor who talked about Hasbro's connection to the Magdalene laundries and how they used workshops allegedly to make some of their board games. That's an incredible piece. You should go read that. It is crazy, and it also connects to potential alleged exploitation in China that's currently happening. Allegedly, again, to make sure that we are legally protected. And so that's the kind of reporting we do on these big industries, because creatively, in terms of the art that they're making, sure, it's super influential, but it doesn't need the kind of critical eye that we want to give to art pieces that are somewhere else. We treat them like the company and corporate institution they are, and then we treat artists like the artists that they are.
Right.
And I think it's worth stating that we can only do that because we are subscriber funded. You know, it's like I've got lots of friends who write for various other like gaming sites. People who make YouTube videos like yourself, and you know, it's like the whole thing of, well, I could do a video on something niche, but I'm going to get more clicks if I put a Space Marine on the thumbnail. Right. We don't have to worry about putting a Space Marine on the thumbnail effectively. And it's a little bit scary sometimes, but it is very freeing, because like even before, like when I was writing stuff for Dicebreaker, there was that whole little nudge of try and make things a bit SEO friendly. You know, if I'm going to write something about one of the Star Wars games, somehow put Star Wars Warhammer in the title or the first paragraph or something like that for getting the clicks. It's really nice not to have to worry about the clicks like that.
Yeah, because then you get the people who are complaining about like, why did you put D&D in this title? It has nothing to do with it. And it's like, well, that's the only way you would have read it actually, based on this model. And that happens so frequently. Same for actual play. Like you have to talk about Critical Role Dimension 20 to be like, hey, here's this thing that's happening. Um, but not having to do that, it's kind of in a way also retraining the media ecosystem and the way people respond to media, because there's definitely like that impulse of click the thing you already know about that you want to learn more about, or click the rage bait thing, as opposed to click the thing that sounds enticing and interesting with none of that involved.
Yeah, and I imagine it's as freeing as it must be. And Caeylin, you said it was a bit scary, and I can imagine that as well because yeah, there is search engine optimization. That's about making sure that your articles are discoverable or your YouTube videos are actually discoverable in the first place, right? You remove that, and then you still have that challenge, like you say, Rowan, about getting people to actually click and commit their time to an article or a video. And if it mentions a load of stuff that they are familiar with, here's why this game is better than or worse than or different to Warhammer 40,000, that's going to bring people in sort of along the journey. So, I mean, how do you just not do any of that? You really are just like, right, we don't need to sort of do that and get people in that way. It's just totally about people will already know of us, so we don't need to do the discoverability in the same way. And then we hope that they are here precisely because they want sort of a more honest article. Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it,
Right.
honestly. Because it's very much our audience. We've gotten people be like, "Hey, write about D&D less, actually. You pick on D&D maybe a little too much. Just focus your energy anywhere else." Which is a fair criticism, I think. But yeah, we have pretty much completely divested from the ad-based affiliate link SEO-based stuff and have relied much more on community word of mouth. And people being like, "Hey, we trust Rascal's opinion on this thing. Rascal is a take on this. Rascal is talking about this. I'm going to read it because I check their site every day or every week."
There is an element of talking about timing, I guess. Is like if something is on people's minds and is new and it's relevant, um, is there an angle that we can cover it from? Because partly because if we're talking about something that is timely, then people are more likely to look at our stuff and pay attention, which means hopefully more subscribers, which is beneficial to us, obviously. But there's also the expectation of what do our readers expect from us. So like at the moment, it's Zine Quest in February. So we spent a lot of time just sort of talking about, well, how are we going to cover this? What do we want to do? Because just saying, oh, it's Zine Quest isn't particularly interesting. And, our readership probably is already aware of that. But at the same time, they do want us to say something about it. So we have to figure out, well, how do we cover this in a way that is interesting and useful, whilst also, just not doing something for the sake of doing it.
Thank you for picking up where my internet decided I was rambling too much and cut me off.
I mean, and you might not be able to talk about this, but I guess from again, an economic perspective, how is that working out for Rascal? Like, are you growing? Are you seeing the reaction and the feedback supporting that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say we're seeing that. We are not stable yet. We are not able to yet pay ourselves a living wage, which is why I had to take that Polygon job. But we are moving towards stability in a way that is faster than I think I expected when we first launched this. Our original plan for Rascal was we're going to try this out for 6 months, see if it's possible. We got to 6 months, seemed like it was possible. We kept going. We were like, all right, let's bring it to a full year. And now we're like, all right, let's try this for like 3 years and see if we can make that keep happening. Right now, everything's up in the air in just the terms of the world. We're going to see what impact tariffs have on people's ability to spend on this, but there does seem to be a desire for this and the way that we approach journalism. We have a really engaged audience that really gives a shit about what we do, because no one's doing it like us. And that seems to be the biggest thing. It is refreshing for, I think, a lot of people to see journalism that both is in touch and familiar with the space in a way that we are, because you have the bigger ones that are just dedicated to covering D&D and things like that. But there's also a real thirst for, like we were saying before, authentic journalism that is just talking about like the problems people are actually facing, because it's a little difficult to maybe like log in to a site every day and see puff pieces or rewritten press release when you look outside and shit's on fire. And people come to games for escapism in a lot of ways, but escapism without larger acknowledgement of context is itself a different problem. Sure. And tying those things together, I think, is really important to be like, we can't run away from this. We can't run away from the way the world is. We don't live in a vacuum. And I think people really, really appreciate that from folks like us, from folks like Aftermath, from Remap, from Defector. And I do really believe that our method to journalism is the future of journalism.
Yeah, that's great. And it may be the future that's drawing on maybe some of the best parts of the past, if that's fair to say. You know, taking the sort of a traditional approach to what journalism at its best is supposed to be, you know, that sort of truth telling and getting to the heart of real stories that matter and bringing them to the surface. Well, you know, is that sort of fair to say as well?
Absolutely.
Great. So you mentioned there that there's maybe a 3-year plan somewhere, and that's, you know, that's out there. Where do you go next? I mean, I know you obviously, Caeylin, you're bringing in more miniatures covering and war game coverage. I know you all launched a podcast relatively recently. I mean, where does Rascal go next over the course of this second year, at least?
Do you have thoughts on that, Caeylin? As the more fresh eyes, I have my own thoughts, but I'll wait to see what you got coming in new.
Yeah, it's like Rowan said, the first year was about seeing, can this work? To which the answer is resoundingly yes. And it's like, now can we make this sustainable? I always think of like a bit of wisdom that you hear from a lot of artists, like a lot of commissioned artists and stuff, is that you don't need 1 million people to love what you do. You just need 1,000 people. If you can get 1,000 people who like what you do enough to give you like $10 a month, then you've made it. So effectively, that's where we are right now. We need to find our 1,000 people, but there's 4 of us, so it's probably 4,000 people. If we can find 4,000 people who are willing to pay us every month for what we do, then we will have the solid base where it's sustainable. We know we can keep doing it, and then we have the foundation, which means we can build, which then means we can expand coverage, we can bring on more contributors, we can do more of what we're doing, and hopefully eventually one day in the future we can all retire, and there will be a whole new crop of rascals carrying on the work.
Yeah, I think that's really it. It is that kind of sustainability. It is that like making a living wage, maybe, by God, benefits. Crazy thought, but we're about halfway there. Honestly, we have roughly 2,000 paying subscribers right now, which is nice. It is incredible that many people want to support us. Again, we need to like double that to make it sustainable for the 4 of us. And then our like avenues of coverage we want to open up more. We want to like we brought in with wargaming. Maybe we expand into other tabletop games like card games or board games if we have the capacity and there is the demand for that. We do more actual play coverage. We hire more voices. Like we have been able to hire some international voices to write about stuff. Doing that in a larger capacity. Like we had um, our contributor Nima, who wrote about the Iranian tabletop scene, which was really cool. And like talking about what it is like to play games and exist as like a progressive person under that regime. Similar to kind of its and reading it, you're like, oh fuck God, it feels uncanny as an American to read that. And we have someone from Argentina currently writing a piece about how actual players are organizing against the fascist regime there. That just went to a protest on Saturday. That is adding that into their coverage. Really talking about the ways in which games allow us both the escapism, but also the international capacity for connection to be able to be like, here is this large community that has been centered in these small spaces like the UK or America or Canada, and acknowledging that they are everywhere else and bringing those voices to be able to speak for themselves on Rascal is a big goal that we have.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I mean, I guess that begs the question, I suppose, where you think the industry is going to go next. I mean, Caeylin, where do you think that war games are going to go over the course of 2025?
What I'm hoping, and I wrote this in an article, we did some sort of end of year roundup things, is I have been really fascinated by the response to Trench Crusade, because it seems to have attracted the attention of a lot of people who were laser focused on 40k before. And it's fascinating because it's basically become baby's first indie war game for a whole lot of people. And I'm really hoping that it causes more people to break out of that very sort of insular, I play one game and one game only space, and to realize how much cool stuff is out there. Because I just think that's better for everyone. I think, it means that other companies make more money. We get to see more creative stuff. We see more competition. And, maybe it means that people won't be quite so upset when Games Workshop changes their army so it doesn't work how it worked like before, because they can go, hey, I can play something else.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of potential for Trench Crusade and what that might do within the marketplace for war games and how that might affect Games Workshop and 40k if it continues in this sort of the way it's been, right?
Yeah, like nothing is going to be a 40k killer. I mean, that's the thing that one of my pet hates is, though, again, it's the YouTube thumbnails, the clickbait headlines of, is this the Warhammer killer? No, it's not. Like the Games Workshop operates on like orders of magnitude above even its closest competitors. It's like it's not going anywhere. But if we can just sort of broaden things in any way, I think that's a good and positive thing. So that's what I'd like to see. Yeah.
And Rowan, what do you think the sort of TTRPG space might look like over the course of this next 12 months?
I think there's going to be a real decentering of the American industry. I think especially as like the trade wars continue to expand, and people stop buying American products and start buying locally instead. I think that is going to have a really huge impact. I think people are gonna pirate games a lot more likely than anything else, just because that's the way it works. We've spoken to people from international places who have said that that's how they've gotten games before, but we are seeing more than ever these burgeoning spaces in like Southeast Asia and Latin America and like Swana, the Middle East. We see it in Europe. There are these big pockets, like Italy is a great example of an international scene that's popping off right now. I think we're going to see that global scene expand. And I think there is going to be a push. I think Rascal, in a way, has been kind of a catalyst for the tabletop space to embrace indie collectives. And there's a thing that I've definitely seen in the year that we've existed, that there is more professionalization. Feels like the right word and the wrong word, because it's professionalizing in a very punk way. Collectivizing maybe is the better word.
Right.
Of people coming together and making shit because they care about one another and want to make stuff and make art in the world, and not necessarily become famous or a celebrity or get on Dimension 20 or Critical Role. Like, people are just going to make real weird art in response to everything going on. And I, for one, am here for it.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I suppose we're certainly cursed to live in interesting times, I think it's fair to say, but it's great to see that Rascal are sort of embracing that and reporting on that and trying to share the truth of all of that through the site. So yeah, thank you very much for your work, and thank you both for joining me to chat about Rascal's history and future. It's been great to chat.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Huge thank you to Rowan and Caeylin for joining me. It was a great chat. I really respect the work that Rascal are doing. If you want to find out more about them and to read some of their news, you can check them out via the link in the description below. I really recommend it for some honest, insightful, and fun news coverage of the tabletop industry. And if you would like to support the work that I do, documenting the history of the tabletop industry, Games Workshop, and the many games that they created, as well as interviewing the people who helped shape that history, you can do so by checking out my Patreon, which also has a link in the description below. Thank you once again to Caeylin and Rowan. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.